Welcome to the Courage to be Courageous. I'm Dan Bolen, your host, and this is a place where you can come to hear people of all across the United States who have fierce fear and maybe has hidden secrets and have the courage to walk through their fear and become their authentic self, where they are authentically peaceful and happy. And I want to thank many of my people who have viewed my podcasts in the last few weeks. Some of you have looked at or have heard them on Spotify, some of them at my website, and I want to thank you for your support on that. This is the reason we do this program, is to help individuals. May not get every single thing out of every podcast, but there will be tidbits that you can pick from each one of them and to help you to be able to overcome fear in your life through courage. And I am so pleased to have a real special guest with us this morning, Katie Hultquist, who is the Director of Leadership Giving for an organization called Outright International. Now, I'd like to give you a little history of how I got connected with Outright. When I came out as gay, I wanted to be able to support some organizations financially and emotionally that I felt were helping the LGBTQ community. And Outright International was one that I decided to support. And I am so pleased to be able to represent them, not only the earnings from my book and the earnings that I get on my podcast will all go to support three organizations, of which Outright International is one of those. So, Katie, we want to welcome you to this podcast this morning. We're going to talk a lot about what Outright International is doing, but we also want to hear a little bit about your personal life and how you came out as gay, as a lesbian, and where you're at today with your personal life, and then we'll get into the Outright International. And I want my listeners to particularly pay close attention when we talk about Outright International, because there's going to be perhaps some surprising stuff, maybe even shocking. But Katie's going to give us a lot of hope, about a hope of what this organization is doing to be able to help individuals throughout the entire world. We're going to talk about that a little later in our podcast. So, Katie, welcome to my podcast, and I'll let you go ahead and talk a little bit about your story.
Well, it's so nice to be here with you today, Dan. I am so excited and grateful to be here, and really appreciate your support and the invitation to come on the podcast and share a little bit about my story and about Outright's work. Again, thank you. As you said, my name is Katie Hultquist, and I use she, her pronouns. Today, I live in Seattle. I've been here about 20 years. I identify as both a lesbian and queer activist, human being. I'm a wife and a mom. I have 3 kids, and I've spent my entire 25-year career working in the nonprofit sector, specifically for different causes related to social justice and gender equality. And I will share a little bit more about that and Outright's work in a little bit. But let me first take you all the way back to when I was a kid in the 1980s. I grew up in San Francisco. My parents and my extended family are in the Midwest, some now in larger cities, but my parents are both from small towns in the Midwest. But they moved to San Francisco when I was a toddler, and I grew up there. So in a very different kind of very liberal big city environment, we would go back to the Midwest every summer to visit our family. And so I always sort of had this different exposure to different kinds of values and experiences and appreciation of lots of different kinds of people and different ways of living. But growing up in San Francisco, it was a very affirming environment, not perfect, especially back in the 1980s. Of course, the gay community was, and all of us were dealing with the AIDS crisis. But I remember it being growing up, I never had any idea that it was wrong to be gay. I had a few teachers in high school who were openly gay. This is even in the late 1980s, early 1990s. So from a very young age, I was very supportive of LGBTQ people and the idea of equality. I just never realized it might apply to me. I didn't know any teenagers who were out at that time, and it wasn't something that we really discussed in my family. But I first realized that I might not be straight during my junior year in college. I went from San Francisco to all the way to Chapel Hill to the University of North Carolina. And when I was a junior, so this would have been in 1995, I was living with several of my closest friends in our sorority house. And when I flew home for Christmas that year, I realized that my feelings for one of them was a little bit, or I guess I should say a lot more than platonic. Basically, I realized that I was in love with her. So I told her how I felt and we started dating. And I quickly realized that this was always, and really always had been something a part of me. I never really dated boys or men. And everything just clicked into place. It just felt so natural and so right. I felt like I was seeing something for the first time that I had never seen before. And I really never looked back. And so I spent the next semester, I was actually headed to Mexico to study abroad for a semester. I dated my girlfriend at the time, long distance. And when I came back for my senior year, I was fully out on campus. And I was extremely fortunate in that my friends were completely supportive. I already had several other queer friends. I also have two younger siblings who were in high school at the time, and they were both completely supportive. It was challenging for my parents to accept and understand at first. I think, I mentioned that sort of their background. They knew a lot of gay people, of course. They worked with gay people in San Francisco, but I don't think that they really had many or any friends with gay kids at that time yet, or that they knew of at least. They were always 100% clear in how much they loved me, and that was totally unconditional. But I think they just didn't want it to be true. I think that they were sad at first because it was something different. They didn't understand. I don't think that they didn't want me to be on the margins of society, which is something they worried about. They didn't want me to be different, and they probably had a lot of assumptions about what being gay would mean. I think, and between us, it was painful for a while, to be honest. I didn't have that phone call with my parents where they'd said, "Oh, we are happy for you and we accept you." They thought it for a while. Their love was never in question, but they were not happy. But eventually, and honestly, pretty quickly in the larger scheme of things, they did their own research to try to learn more, and they really learned to accept it pretty quickly over the next couple of years. They ultimately became very supportive of me, my career, and my life. They have been extremely supportive of my relationship with my wife, who I've been with for 25 years this month. And they have been very supportive. We have 3 kids. They've been very supportive of our family. They supported our weddings, and I can share more about our family's journey, but they were there for all of we had to get married more than once, Dan, to get it to stick. They were there every time. They were there with flowers and with toasts and with their support every time, and they're very loving grandparents. So I guess I would just say that, as far as coming out goes, the one other thing I wanted to say is that a memory that really stands out for me in college is National Coming Out Day, which if anyone doesn't know, October 11th is National Coming Out Day. And I remember that day in 1995. So this is the first October 11th after I came out, and it was my senior year in college. And I remember the campus organization for LGBT students did an action where queer people and allies could come and stand in the center of campus to show our visibility and the strength of our community. And it was so nerve-wracking, but incredibly powerful to step out and up in front of the entire community and mostly strangers, because I never wanted to apologize for who I was. And I always wanted to demand to be treated equally, but it was very scary. This is a time when in North Carolina, Jesse Helms is still, I can't believe I'm saying this, but Jesse Helms was still one of our U.S. senators. It was before Ellen came out, before celebrities in any large number or noticeable number of celebrities or politicians were out. This was before the sodomy laws, the anti-homosexuality laws were struck down. That didn't happen until 2003 nationally. And of course, marriage equality is many, many years away. So it was very scary, but it was extremely powerful to be visible, to be with community. And I think it was really a turning point for me in terms of becoming more of an activist. And I still celebrate October 11th every year as a very joyful day in my life, in my journey of becoming the full person I was supposed to be.
I want to share something. You made many powerful comments, but one thing I heard you say, Katie, that really resonated with me. You said you began to realize that who you were was a part of who you were. In other words, in order for people to accept you, they have to really understand and accept that part. That's who you are. That's your soul. That's who you are. And I think you made I'm going to comment on the courageousness that you took. You had the support of the community, of the gay community. You had the support of your friends, but you also had to have courage to come out to your parents and tell them. And it was pretty shortly after that you came out that you told the parents. What a tremendous example of courage. And I remember one comment that Katie made to me yesterday. I wasn't going to allow my family's homophobia to keep me from progressing forward. Their own homophobia is not going to keep me from progressing forward. That's a powerful statement. And I really appreciate you making that comment too, because this is who you are. The sexuality is a part of our life. It's not our life. It's just a part of our life. But it also is an important part of our life. And that needs to be celebrated too. So I want to thank you for the courage that you did to be able to do that as well. So
I never felt that I could be. I feel fortunate, I guess. I didn't do anything to deserve, sort of the place where I grew up, how I grew up, but I never really had. I was so fortunate that I never really. I would not say I never had any internalized homophobia. I think it's something we probably all deal with, but I was able to. I just accepted it. I felt kind of stupid, to be honest with you, that I hadn't realized it earlier. It would have helped clarify things a lot if I had realized it a few years earlier. But I never thought that there was something wrong with me, and I always wanted. I always have walked into every room expecting people to treat me with the same kind of respect and, equality that anyone else deserves when they walk into a room. It's not always there, but I've always felt that we deserve that for ourselves and for our community and our siblings. And that's part of the reason why I eventually I was already an activist at that time on campus on other issues, right? So I was working with groups to undo and end racism on campus. I was working with groups around women's rights. We were at that time trying to get the University of North Carolina to start. It didn't have a women's center, and we were trying to get it to start its first women's center. We were trying to get the university to approve a freestanding Black cultural center. There's many things that I was involved in on campus, but it wasn't related to LGBT activism. And the act of coming out and that act of standing up on campus and being visible and being part of the community was just like the next natural step on my journey. And then from there, like most of my career has been in the nonprofit sector, but only in the past 5 years have I professionally been involved in the LGBT movement. My activism really started around LGBT rights started as a personal thing because of my coming out, and I can share more about that if you want. But being a young person, what does that mean to advocate for my community? And then becoming a wife, becoming a mom, what does it mean to advocate for my community? It was a very personal thing at first.
Of course. And all of that took courage on your part, Katie. You've been a very courageous woman. And I thank you for sharing your story with us. I want to talk now about Outright International, an organization that I support, totally support 100%. And I want her to share some of the things that are going on with the Outright organization, what they're doing as far as laws and connection with the United Nations. This is a very powerful story, and I want Katie to really share with us what's going on, what's happening in Uganda, what's happening in Ukraine, because Outright International is fighting for the rights all over the world to be treated fairly. And we're not there yet, but we've made lots of progress, but we're not there where we want to be. So, Katie, tell me a little bit about Outright International and the work that you're doing.
I'd love to, Dan. So I first joined Outright about 8 years ago. A friend introduced me to the organization and asked me if I would become a donor, which I immediately decided to do. I couldn't believe, to be perfectly honest with you, that I hadn't heard about the organization before, because I have always had an interest in international issues. I studied international studies as my major in college. I mentioned that I studied abroad in Mexico. I used to work for an organization based in Latin America. I have a goddaughter in Central America. I have always had an interest. I love traveling, but for some reason, I had not really thought that much about what life is like for LGBT people around the world. So when I found out about Outright, I immediately got involved as a donor, and then I joined the board. And now I've been on the staff team for about 5 years. And I think it's important to start with what is our mission and why we're doing what we're doing. So for those who aren't familiar with Outright, we are a 32-year-old nonprofit organization. We are headquartered in New York City. We have staff in over 12 countries. And our mission is entirely about fighting for the human rights of LGBTIQ plus people around the world, especially in places where our communities face extreme persecution, discrimination, and violence. And we focus specifically on the global South and East. So parts of Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and the Caribbean are our major focus areas. And the reason why Outright was started in 1990 and that our work is still so critical is that while there is no country that has achieved full equality, and we see an incredible backlash happening here in the US, there are huge disparities around the world in terms of progress and the threats that LGBTQ people face. And I think it would be helpful to share a couple of examples so people understand what I'm talking about. There are still about 67 countries that have laws criminalizing same-sex relations, and 11 of those have laws that impose the death penalty. And we're going to come back and talk about Uganda in a little while. But there are 50 countries that have laws that criminalize transgender people, either explicitly or implicitly. There are about 14 countries that explicitly ban so-called conversion therapy, which are, for those who don't know, traumatic and abusive practices to try to force people to change their sexual orientation and gender identity. And there are many places around the world where recording a conversation like this, distributing an educational session like this, gathering together with other LGBT people, or speaking out about LGBT experiences and rights could be cause for arrest. So the situation is very grave in a lot of places. But, and you said hope. You know I love to talk about hope, Dan. That's because there has been so much progress over the last few decades. We have seen more than 15 countries decriminalize homosexuality in the last 10 years. 32 countries have approved marriage equality at a federal level. More than half of those have been in the last 5 years. And there is what I could only describe as a vibrant and burgeoning network of activists and local groups that are pressing for change in almost every country in the world. So what motivates me is, and I think the bottom line is that there is a huge opportunity to radically accelerate social and legal change right now. And that's why Outright matters. And that's why the work that our local partners around the world are doing matters. So how do we do that? Well, we amplify, we advocate, we support, and we celebrate the LGBT movement around the world. And the way that we do that is through three primary strategies. The first is that we do a lot of research. And that's because there's not a lot of data about how our communities are faring globally. And we need to document human rights abuses when they happen. But we also need an evidence base to push for change, to push for governments to change, to push for more funding, to have the experiences of our communities documented and our lives advocated for. So a couple of examples of that. We just released our second report a couple of months ago about how LGBT people in Afghanistan are faring under the Taliban. You could imagine it's not good, but we are trying to raise the red flag to governments and key stakeholders around the world that can do something about it. We published the first global report looking at the incidence and impact of conversion practices around the world and how they're harming our community. We release a report every year during Pride season, looking at how Pride is celebrated and being attacked around the world. Those are just a few examples of the research. But the second thing we do, and you mentioned the United Nations, Dan, is advocacy. And that's because international pressure is necessary to stop human rights violations and to codify rights through progressive laws and policies. So what we do is we work with local partners to try to create opportunities for legal or policy change around the world. And we also take up space at the United Nations. And that's why we're based in New York. We have what's called ECOSOC consultative status. We're the only US-based LGBT organization that has consultative status at UN headquarters. And we have a few full-time staff who are working at the United Nations to work with world governments and agencies to ensure that LGBTIQ people are included and not left behind. We helped start and basically coordinate the UN LGBTI core group, which is a group of, I think, over 42 now member states that are collaborating to protect the human rights of our community. And the third thing we do is we support the grassroots LGBT movement around the world, because we really believe, Dan, that having strong LGBTI organizations and activists is the most important thing to produce change and make progress happen. So we support thousands of activists every year through training, fellowship programs, providing technical assistance, and grant making. And I think, that is one way that I can illustrate that is through our humanitarian assistance work that we've been doing. You mentioned Ukraine. Outright, because we used to believe in supporting the grassroots movement, we try to respond when our partners need financial support. And so both during COVID and then when the invasion of Ukraine happened, we launched emergency funds to help the LGBTIQ community. That's because in humanitarian relief and recovery situations, we are often either left behind or not reached, or sometimes intentionally excluded. And we need to make sure but we are also often more disproportionately impacted by crisis. So our Ukraine fund is a great example. We were able to launch a fund within 24 hours of the Russian invasion. To date, we've distributed, I think, over $2.6 million to 39 local partners. These are local LGBT organizations, mostly in Ukraine. Ukraine has a very vibrant LGBT movement, some in neighboring countries that are working with refugees. And with that funding, they're able to make sure that gay people, queer people, trans people who are on the ground are getting the resources they need. They're getting medical care, they're getting food, they're getting water, they're getting assistance migrating if that's what they need. And they're just making sure that our community survives in a time of crisis. So those are some examples of the kind of work that we're doing. And I can certainly share more about any of that. We can also talk a little bit about what's happening in Uganda, because I think it's really important right now for people to pay attention and be aware of how our community is being targeted and what they can do to help.
I want to thank you. You've given us so much encouragement in what you've done in Ukraine and what you're doing. Not only are you courageous, but your organization outright is courageous. They're moving forward. They're helping people who are struggling with laws against who they are. And one of the things I want my audience to think about here is she made a comment that in 11 countries, the death penalty is instituted for gay people. Is that correct, Katie? Did I hear that right? 11 countries, you can be killed for being gay or transgendered or queer. That is shocking to me. That is absolutely shocking to me. We have a tendency in this country to look at our own little world, but we have to look globally. We have freedoms here. We're not equal here, but we have freedoms here these other countries do not have. But to realize that there are laws against transgender, there are laws against gay people or lesbians or queer people, some to the point of death penalties. They're killing them. My audience needs to understand that. As a part of this organization, we have to support outright. We have to support organizations that are fighting for changing laws. This isn't just about our community. It's about humanity. This is what they're doing is inhuman. We have to be able to support organizations not only against the LGBTQ family, but against humanity. I've shared some of these thoughts with different individuals that are part of my community here that are straight, and they find it shocking that this is happening in other countries. They need to be aware that this is actually happening and what the laws need to be changed and what you're doing. And my hat's out to Outright International, because they're fighting for the rights of humanity as well as concentrating on the LGBTQ organization. And but I want the audience to really understand this is about our community and supporting our community. And Katie expressed that so well. But it's also fighting for the rights of humanity, and that's important for me.
And just to build on what you just said, Dan, I think I shared this with you before, but I often tell people that looking at, you should care. Hopefully you know someone who's gay, you know someone who's trans, you know someone who's queer, and you're a part of our community or you care about someone who's a part of our community. But even if we just look at humanity, as you say, like the entire human family, the truth is that the LGBTQ community is really like the canary in the coal mine, Dan. And what I mean by that is, if you look at how gay people, queer people, trans people are being treated in any given society or country or culture around the world, you will get a window on how that society is doing on human rights for the entire population and for other marginalized communities. Because we really are it is very clear from looking at what's happening to our community. And we're often, one of the first targets that is attacked when a larger attack on human rights is happening. So I think paying attention to what's happening to queer people is really vital for everyone who cares about human rights or what's happening with humanity. And in addition to that, I agree with you. I want people to understand how serious the problems are and the danger is, but I also want them to know how much hope I have and how much opportunity there is, because, even and we'll talk more about Uganda in a minute, but, Uganda has probably the world's, if the bill that has been passed by Parliament there is signed into law by the president, it will be one of, if not the worst, anti-homosexuality laws in the world. Yet there are dozens of LGBT organizations on the ground in Uganda that are working very hard to protect the human rights of our community, to serve our community in different ways. And I am very buoyed by that knowledge, by that understanding that there are activists on the ground, human rights defenders, people who are standing up for our community, and that there is progress happening almost everywhere. So I don't want people to have, I would like for them to have, they should be shocked. We should be shocked as humans, and we'd be shocked into action. But we should also know that it is not hopeless. It is not a hopeless situation. There is something that we can do, and there is an opportunity to make progress. And the last thing that I would say before maybe diving in a little bit deeper on what's happening in Uganda is just that I always tell people to, please don't forget, please just remember that we're all connected. And I think COVID really exemplified that for all of us, how interconnected we are as humans across the globe. We can't afford to forget about or ignore what's happening in different parts of the world. We are all connected. We are all siblings in this human family and in this LGBTQ community. And so that means, and I think that means that we have to stay vigilant at home and engaged. And this is where, to me, the importance of standing up for our community, and especially being allies to the transgender community, those of us who identify as cis or are not part of the community. But for me, the trans community is so important and beloved. I have trans family members, I have trans colleagues and friends, and they are so under attack right now in the U.S. We have to stand up and do something about that. But we also need to do something to stand up for our siblings around the world. So I always try to encourage people to make sure you're doing something local, or, in your city, in your state, here in the U.S., make sure you're doing something. Don't sit back on your laurels, because we see the backlash, and it is real. And it's, there's over 400 bills right now across the U.S. that are attacking LGBT rights, mostly state legislatures.
400
that is something
bills?
that we have to, more than 400.
Oh,
and I think over 25 or 30 have already passed. So we have to stay vigilant. But please also stay vigilant and pay attention to what's happening outside of our borders, because we are all connected, and we have to stand with each other.
And I think this gets back, because it's a human rights issue. Human rights are being under attack. Not only, and I think that's where our straight men and women who are allies to us, we have a community of straight people that support us, and they see the inhumane things that are going on. So we want to encourage those that are straight and are fighting for equal rights to be able to do something and being able to support not only the LGTBTQ community, but also the community as well. So I want to make sure that we understand we have some wonderful straight heterosexual allies that are supporting us as well. And I think
Can I add something to that, Dan?
Sure.
Yes, just about being allies. This is for straight people, but another topic that I'm really passionate about is religious allies.
Right.
And I was raised in the Episcopal Church in San Francisco, and we have a history there of inclusion. But one of the things that I am really passionate about is religious allies speaking out very, very forcefully that their faith, that in support of affirming and accepting LGBTQ people because of their faith.
That's a good comment.
Because we have a lot of, whether you're talking about, baseball players and hockey players with Pride Nights, or U.S. religious groups that are funding anti-LGBT legislation in Uganda and other parts of Africa, there is not a shortage of religious people standing up and saying that say, being gay goes against, or promoting conversion therapy, that being gay in some way goes against their religious teachings. But the reality is that I don't think that conservative or extremist religious people own the concept of faith or social justice. I think that there are plenty of clergy and people of faith in all faith traditions that accept and affirm LGBT people, not only because it's a human rights issue, but because their faith teaches them to love everyone. And so I see you, those of you who are doing that already, I see you. If you are a person of faith who is loving and welcoming and accepting of gay people, of trans people, I hope that you will speak out, whether it's in your congregation or in your neighborhood or online, wherever the spaces you are, that you hear, when you hear someone talking about homophobia or transphobia, and they're coming at it from a place of religion or faith, I hope that you will speak out. That is one place that we really need religious allies to be vocal and to be loud.
I want to share a comment on that because I think that's a key point. Of course, I was a part of organized religion for many years, served as an elder in the church for many years, and I understand a lot of the homophobia comments that go on. But there are people, I think it's interesting. I go back to the teachings of Jesus. Jesus taught love. He taught acceptance. And it's interesting, if you've read the Bible, Jesus said nothing about gay. Zero. So if it was an issue, don't you think he would have brought it up? He was accepting and loving of all people. So for people to accept the LGBTQ community, that's following the example of Jesus. Although I do feel organized religion has done so much damage to our community. It's interesting. One gentleman made a comment to me. He said, I had to leave organized religion to find God. So it does show that there are people with faith out there that associate with an organization that are fighting for the rights of LGBTQ people, and we want to thank them for doing that. But I want us also to really focus on what Jesus taught, because most all religions, or at least Christianized religions here, teach the teachings of Jesus, and he taught love and acceptance. And I remember when he was crucified at the end, and he said to his Father, and of course he was killed by his own people, the Jews, he said, "Forgive them, Father, for they do not know what they have done." So it's forgiveness that he taught as well. But I think that's a powerful point. Those that do have faith in our community, those that are supporting the LGBTQ community, that's a part of the faith of accepting all for who they are, for who they were created. We were created who we are. And I think that's Dan, a powerful point.
This is a holy, today is the beginning of Passover. This is Holy Week when we're recording this conversation. And so it's actually a really important time, I think, to talk about this. And one thing that, Outright does, of course, we work with many LGBT people who are also people of faith. It's not just religious allies. It's, so many queer people who are people of faith in one religious tradition or another. And one program that we do that really works on this is we have a United Nations Religion Fellowship where we support activists from primarily Africa and the Caribbean that are fighting, many of whom are people of faith, and they're dealing with very extreme religiously motivated homophobia and transphobia in their countries and their contexts in which they work. And so we are specifically trying to support them in countering those narratives. And this might be a good segue to talking a little bit about what's happening in Uganda. I really want people to be aware, if they haven't heard yet, that last week the Parliament of Uganda passed a new anti-homosexuality bill that is, I think, only 2 or maybe 3 members of Parliament objected and voted against the bill. So over 300 members of Parliament voted for this legislation that is now awaiting signature from the president of Uganda. And to be clear, homosexuality was already criminalized in Uganda. So this is just adding additional penalties and also extending some parts of criminalization to other activities that are related to being LGBTIQ. So let me explain a little bit why Outright and some of my colleagues call this the world's, if it passes, it will be the world's worst anti-LGBTQ legislation. And this is why. First, Uganda would join that small group, which we don't want anyone to be a member of countries that impose the death penalty. In Uganda's case, the death penalty would be imposed for repeated consensual same-sex intimacy. So we're talking about people who are having intimate relations with a partner, for example, like me and my wife, or you and your partner, anyone who might have repeated consensual same-sex intimacy, or for consensual relations with a same-sex partner that has a disability. And Dan, even one quote-unquote homosexual act would be punishable with life in prison. That is the extremity of what we're talking about here. Not only that, but the law would impose prison time for anyone who fails to report someone that they have a reasonable suspicion has committed or intends to commit an act of homosexuality. So doctors and nurses would have to report their patients, parents would have to report their kids, teachers would have to report their students, employees would have to report their coworkers, knowing that reporting them could subject them to life in prison or the death penalty. This is absolutely abhorrent. It goes beyond that. The law also criminalizes any quote unquote promotion of homosexuality. So people who run nonprofit organizations that focus on supporting the LGBTQ community, or development agencies, development partners who fund HIV or health and human rights work in Uganda, could be held personally criminally liable for promoting and normalizing homosexuality, including via the internet. And there's more.
Wow.
But those are just some examples of how heinous this is. And really, we issued a statement last week just saying, in no uncertain terms, this is a brazen assault on the basic human rights of LGBT people, not only LGBT people, but also their friends, family members, and allies. And what's really alarming, Dan, is that we see this backlash of anti-LGBT organizing and harmful legislative action happening not just in Uganda, but also in Ghana, in Kenya, and beyond. And, something that I find especially disgusting is that it has been stoked and funded for years by fundamentalist, extremist religious groups in the U.S. So that is a legacy that we have to grapple with and frankly answer for. And what we really want to ask people to do is to make sure that we as a society are stopping and pausing and noticing and loudly condemning this bill, that we are asking the president, who is very anti-LGBT, unfortunately, but insisting publicly that he veto it. And probably most importantly, that we support the activists in Uganda and Africa who are really working tirelessly to try to protect our human rights, to change hearts and minds, and to create a strong and lasting movement, no matter what happens in this moment. So I really want your listeners and everyone that I have been talking to these days to know what's happening there, to know that it's not just limited to Uganda, and to know that their loud action and support is really needed right now.
Wow, that is it's shocking what Uganda has done. It's just shocking. And I want to encourage all to take to heart what Katie said, think about it, and do whatever we can to oppose this heinous crime against our community. I want to thank you, Katie, for sharing that with us. I want to have Katie on in the near future too, because I'd like us to keep finding out as things go on and what Outright International is doing to be able to fight for the rights of our community. And as I said before, they're human rights. And I'd like to keep us posted on that. What's happening maybe 6 months to a year, we can come back and talk to Katie again. I want to thank you, Katie, so much for the work that you have done and what Outright International has done. I want people to, and I'm going to have Katie give a contact information there. If you can support Outright International, I really encourage you to do that. I have done that. They are a part of my trust when I die, because I want to give money to fight this discrimination against our community. So, Katie, give some information on how they can contact you, how they can make a donation if they would like. Give that information, and I thank you so much for being a part of our program, the courage that you've shown, the courage that Outright International has shown. We're not going to let go of this. We're going to fight for this. I'm support the fight that we have, but we're fighting with hope, and we're fighting with some power, because I think within hope there is power, and I think I want to commend you for that as well. So, Katie, give them some contact information, how they can reach you.
Thank you, Dan. Well, in terms of what people can do, the first thing I just want to say is, if you are a member, even if you haven't told one other person yet, but if you are a member of the LGBTQ community, please love and accept yourself, and know that there is a community of people here that are ready to love and accept you. If you are an ally to our community, please warmly and loudly love and accept the LGBTQ people in your life, and let them know that you love them and have the courage to stand up for them. Please pay attention to what's happening in Uganda and around the world. You can follow news about what's happening to our community, in part by following Outright. You can find us at www.outrightinternational.org, or you can find us on social media. We are on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, and our social media handle is at Outright INTL. Please share our work and that of our partners, which we often amplify. Having people share and bring more visibility to the issues that we're facing is really critical. And as you said, Dan, you can also support us financially. You can make a one-time gift. You can sign up to make monthly donations. You can come to our events. You can join our Outstanding Legacy Circle and make it part of your estate plans. The reason why this is so important, Dan, is that our global movement is incredibly under-resourced. So only 28 cents out of every $100 that's contributed charitably in the U.S. every year, 28 cents out of every $100 goes to LGBT causes. And globally, less than half of all charitable giving to LGBT causes goes to organizations outside of the U.S. and Canada. So it's incredibly under-resourced. And unfortunately, by contrast, more than $6 billion over the past decade has flowed to oppose LGBT rights and women's rights globally. So we need more investment to propel progress. And your financial support, Dan, and the financial support of anybody who might be listening is greatly appreciated. And the last thing I would just say is what you said earlier, which is just to have hope, just to leave feeling inspired to do something and to have hope, because there is progress happening everywhere. And there are extremely talented, experienced, strategic, and smart activists and advocates from our community and allies who are doing the work. And we want you to be a part of it. So I just ask you to have hope and to get engaged.
Thank you so much. I think you provided some good hope for us as well too. We may get knocked down, but we get back up. We're going to
We
get back
do.
up every time. Thank you
And
so
thank you
much.
for inspiring me, Dan. Your story and your how you're paying it forward with your own courage,
Well,
personally, but also the courage to try to make a difference is truly inspiring to me.
thank you so much, Katie, and I appreciate your courage. I appreciate the courage of Outright International, and I want to have Katie back in a few months and talk about some of the progress that we're making. Again, Katie gave you the information that you can contact and contribute to the organization. We can all see the atrocities of what's happening in these countries, but we also can do something about it. Thinking is different than doing. We can think about what's happening and feel upset about it, but let's do something about it. And Katie has given us some encouragement, some hope, and we can do something about this, what's happening across the entire world against humanity and against the LGBTQ community. Thank you, Katie, so much. Thank you for sharing the podcast with us, and we'll look forward to meeting you in the near future. Thanks again.